At 6.7 meters below the surface, something is there, not rock, not soil. A team of Turkish and American scientists aimed state-of-the-art radar at a 163-meter formation on Mount Ararat. They found corridors, 3 superimposed floors, the chemical signature of decomposing wood in a place where no forest has existed for millennia. And in March 2026, ceramic fragments over 5,000 years old were found at the same site, forcing the Turkish government to protect it urgently, before people knew what they were touching. What they don't want you to see is in this video, from beginning to end. At 18 kilometers of altitude, the reconnaissance plane's camera recorded something the pilot could not explain. It was not a mountain. It was not a valley. It was an outline. Symmetrical, elongated, with curves that geology does not produce. At least not in that way, not with that proportion, not at that angle. The Turkish captain İlhan Durupinar looked at the aerial image in 1959 and had the same reaction anyone would have upon seeing it for the first time. That looked like a boat, not vaguely, not with interpretive goodwill, with the sharpness of a naval hull seen from above, defined bow, rounded stern, edges raised relative to the center, length disproportionate to the width, in a way that nature rarely produces by accident, and it was on Mount Ararat, the mountain that the Bible, the Quran, and traditions of at least 8 distinct cultures around the world identify as the location where a vessel ran aground after a flood that destroyed civilization. For decades, the formation was studied, photographed, debated, and discarded. Geologists said it was a natural fold of the terrain. Biblical researchers said it was evidence of the flood. The debate remained stuck in this cycle for 60 years, without resolution, without consensus, without the technology necessary to go beyond the surface. Then, starting in 2019, a Turkish-American team arrived at the site with instruments that do not look at the surface. They look at what is underneath it. Ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography, high-precision LiDAR, equipment that records data in numbers, not in beliefs. What these instruments found, at 6.7 meters of depth inside that formation, stopped the team in the middle of their work. Corridors, internal spaces, 3 layers superimposed with geometric regularity, rectangular shapes, distributed in a pattern that the researchers themselves described as, and this is the exact word used in the technical report, inexplicable by known natural geological processes. And in March of 2026, pottery fragments over 5,000 years old were found at the site during roadworks in the region, forcing the Turkish government to consider formal protection of the site before the evidence disappears into the hands of tourists who do not know what they are touching. But the detail that no one is discussing, the data that the team recorded and that completely changes the weight of this investigation, is not the radar. It is not the pottery. It is not the outline of the hull. It is what the soil analyses found inside that formation that does not exist at any point in the surrounding terrain. And when you understand what it is, you will understand why this could be the most significant archaeological discovery of the century. There is a question that anthropologists have been asking for more than 1 century, and that still has no satisfactory answer. Why do cultures that never had contact with each other, separated by oceans, by continents, by millennia of independent development, tell essentially the same story? A global flood, a chosen man, a vessel built to save life on Earth. The waters covering everything, the gradual return to dry land, the restart of humanity from a single survivor and his family. This narrative does not belong only to the Bible. It appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest literary text humanity possesses, written on Sumerian clay tablets that antedate the biblical text by at least 1,000 years. It appears in the Hindu Vedas, in the figure of Manu, the first man, who was warned by a sacred fish about an imminent flood and built a boat to survive. It appears in the oral traditions of indigenous peoples of North America, South America, Australia, Melanesia, and ancient China. The mythologist James Frazer catalogued in his work Folklore in the Old Testament, published in 1918, more than 200 flood narratives in cultures around the world, 200 independent, converging on the same central event. This does not prove that the flood happened, but it places on the table a question that simple skepticism does not resolve: how to explain the universality of a specific narrative in cultures that did not communicate. There are three main hypotheses circulating in academic literature. The first is the Jungian hypothesis, the idea that the flood is a universal archetype of the human collective unconscious, a metaphor for destruction and rebirth that emerges spontaneously in any culture because it corresponds to a fundamental psychological structure. This hypothesis is intellectually elegant but archaeologically unfalsifiable. There is no way to test whether a psychological archetype produces independent narratives or if independent narratives reveal an archetype. The second hypothesis is the diffusionist one, the idea that the flood narrative originated in a single place and spread through routes of trade, migration, and cultural contact much earlier than conventional historiography recognizes. This hypothesis has gained strength in recent decades with archaeological discoveries, demonstrating that contact between ancient civilizations was much more extensive and early than imagined. The problem is that it requires a common origin old enough to explain the presence of the narrative in cultures that separated more than 10,000 years ago. The third hypothesis, the most uncomfortable for the academic establishment, is the simplest. The narrative is universal because the event was universal, because it happened, and because cultures all over the world preserved it in their oral traditions, because their ancestors experienced it. This third hypothesis is not necessarily religious, it is geological, because geology has something to say about catastrophic floods on a global scale, and what it says is more complex than popular consensus suggests. The global sea level has risen approximately 120 meters since the last glacial maximum, about 21,000 years ago, when large quantities of water were trapped in continental glaciers. This melting process was not linear or gradual in all periods. There were rapid melting events, called meltwater pulses in scientific literature, during which the sea level rose several meters in a matter of centuries or even decades. Meltwater pulse 1A, occurring approximately between 14,500 and 14,000 years ago, raised the sea level by approximately 16 meters in less than 340 years. For any coastal civilization existing at that time, this would be a catastrophe of proportions impossible to imagine. Entire coasts submerged, islands disappearing, fertile plains swallowed by the ocean in a matter of generations. But there is a specific event, much more recent, that several researchers associate directly with the flood narrative in Middle Eastern traditions. Around 5,700 BC, approximately 7,700 years ago, the Mediterranean Sea broke through what is today the Bosphorus Strait and catastrophically flooded a huge freshwater basin that existed where the Black Sea is today. Geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman of Columbia University documented this event in detail in their book Noah's Flood, published in 1998. According to their research, the flooding of the Black Sea occurred with a speed and scale that would be absolutely catastrophic for any population living on the shores of that basin. And underwater archaeological evidence in the Black Sea includes submerged human structures that confirm the presence of civilization in this area before the flood. A water catastrophe of this magnitude in a region that is exactly the cradle of the civilizations that produced humanity's first written texts, Sumerians, Akkadians, Hebrews, would be the type of event that would leave a permanent mark on the collective memory of all the peoples descended from those cultures. And it did. What the texts describe, what geology recorded, and what anthropology catalogued converge on the same cautious conclusion. Something happened. Sometime between 7,000 and 5,000 years ago, with enough magnitude to be preserved in the memory of cultures worldwide. The question that remains, the question that the Durupinar Formation on Mount Ararat raises in a physical and measurable way, is whether that event left not only memory in oral traditions, but also an artifact atop a mountain in Turkey, an artifact that modern instruments are currently finding, layer by layer, meter by meter, and whose interior has not yet been completely revealed. In 1959, NATO was conducting a systematic aerial photography program of Turkish territory for military mapping purposes. It was routine work, methodical overflights, cameras pointed at the ground, kilometers of film developed and archived without most of the images ever drawing anyone's attention. Eastern Turkey, a mountainous, remote, geologically complex region, produced interesting images from a cartographic point of view, but rarely surprising ones. Until Captain İlhan Durupinar came across a specific image. The photograph showed a slope in the Mount Ararat region, approximately 29 kilometers south of the mountain's main peak, at an altitude of about 2,300 meters. And in the middle of that slope, partially buried in the terrain, there was a formation that Durupinar could not fit into any geological category he knew. The outline was that of a ship's hull, not approximately, not with imagination, with the geometric precision of a vessel seen from above, bow pointed north, stern rounded south, raised side edges creating a central depression, a length visibly disproportionate to the width in a way that the surrounding mountainous terrain did not reproduce at any other visible point in the image. Durupinar measured the outline in the photograph and calculated the actual length of the formation, 163 meters. He knew what the Bible said about the ark's dimensions. Every Turk of Islamic background knows the story of Noah in the Quran. The ark is described in Genesis as being 300 cubits long. A standard Hebrew cubit is equivalent to approximately 45 centimeters. 300 cubits correspond to approximately 137 meters, but there is debate over which cubit standard was used in the original text, with some versions using the Egyptian royal cubit of approximately 52 centimeters, which would result in 156 meters. Other scholars use the Babylonian royal cubit, which would produce a result even closer to the 163 meters measured by Durupinar. The correspondence was not perfect, but it was too close to be ignored. Durupinar took the photograph to his superior, who forwarded it for analysis. The image reached the hands of the American photo interpreter working with NATO in the region, and eventually the attention of American archaeologist Arthur Brandenberger of Ohio State University, an expert in photo interpretation. Brandenberger examined the image and publicly declared, "I identify this as a boat." See, the declaration from an academic expert was enough to turn Durupinar's discovery into international news. Life magazine published an article on the formation in September of 1960. The world had its first contact with what would come to be called the Durupinar Formation. The following expedition, led by American Captain Duane Parrish in 1960, was the first of many visits to the site that would produce more questions than answers. The terrain around the formation proved to be extraordinarily difficult. The Mount Ararat region is in a border zone between Turkey, Iran, and the former Soviet Union, which during the Cold War made access extremely complicated for geopolitical reasons that had nothing to do with archaeology. Expeditions were blocked, delayed, and interrupted by Turkish military restrictions. Some teams reached the site only to discover that the unstable terrain had altered the surface since the last visit. Turkish geologist Doğan Kuban visited the site in the early 60s and issued the first formal scientific opinion. The formation was a natural geological fold, the result of tectonic processes common in the region. without any evidence of artificial origin. This opinion became the standard position of mainstream geology and remained practically uncontested for almost 30 years, not because it was irrefutable, but because no one yet had the tools to go beyond surface observation. Renewed interest would come decades later, driven by an event that geology did not plan, but that archaeological investigation took advantage of. In 1988, a combination of an earthquake and heavy rains caused significant erosion on the slope where the formation was located. The soil covering part of the structure was removed by the force of the water and seismic movement, exposing outlines that were not visible before. Aerial photographs taken after the event showed an even more defined formation than the one from 1959, with surface details that increased the interest of the researchers following the case. It was in this context that Ron Wyatt, the same Ron Wyatt from the Gulf of Aqaba, visited the site for the first time and became one of the most active researchers investigating the Durupinar Formation throughout the 80s and 90s. Wyatt collected soil samples, made surface measurements, and published reports that, like everything he produced, were received with skepticism by academia, but with enthusiasm by independent biblical research communities. Wyatt's problem was always the same: insufficient methodology for the weight of the claims. But Wyatt did one thing that turned out to be more important than any report he published. He kept interest in the site alive during decades when mainstream academia had closed the matter. And this accumulated interest was what eventually attracted researchers with more solid credentials and, crucially, access to technology that would completely transform the quality of the possible investigation. Because observing the surface of a formation and declaring it natural or artificial without knowing what is underneath it is, from a scientific point of view, a conclusion based on incomplete evidence. And what is beneath the Durupinar Formation, what modern instruments began to reveal starting in 2019, is what makes the previous 60 years of debate seem, in retrospect, like a discussion about the cover of a book that no one had yet opened. There is a technology that archaeologists affectionately call the ground X-ray. GPR, ground penetrating radar, works by emitting pulses of electromagnetic energy directly into the ground and measuring the time these pulses take to reflect back to the receiver when they encounter an interface between materials of different densities. Solid rock reflects one way, compacted soil reflects another, wood reflects another. Empty space, a cavity, a corridor, a chamber, reflects in a way completely distinct from everything around it. The result is a stratigraphic profile of the subsoil, a cross-sectional image of what exists below the surface, layer by layer, without digging a single shovel of earth. The technology is not new. GPR has been used for decades in archaeology, civil engineering, landmine detection, and geological prospecting. But the precision of modern equipment and the computer processing power to interpret the raw data has reached a level in recent years that makes it possible to identify objects and structures with details that would have been unthinkable in previous versions of the technology. It was with latest generation GPR that the Noah's Ark Scans project team arrived at the Durupinar Formation in 2019. The Noah's Ark Scans project is a Turkish-American initiative that brings together researchers from Istanbul Technical University, Turkish geologists, and American specialists in remote sensing and non-invasive archaeology. The team was careful to establish from the beginning that its objective was scientific, to collect data, not to confirm a theory. The work protocol was designed to ensure that results could be verified independently by any researcher with access to the raw data. The 2019 campaign systematically covered the surface of the formation in parallel passes, with the GPR equipment being dragged over the terrain in lines spaced 1 meter apart, close enough to ensure complete coverage without significant gaps. Each pass produced a continuous subsoil profile. The set of all profiles was then computer processed to generate a three-dimensional image of the interior of the formation. The first days of work produced data confirming what was already expected. The formation had an internal composition different from the surrounding terrain. The density of the internal material was distinct from the density of the surrounding mud flow and sedimentary rock, which already ruled out, at least partially, the hypothesis that the formation was simply a homogeneous geological fold with no differentiated internal structure. But it was when the researchers began processing the data from the central passes of the formation that the equipment recorded something that stopped the work. At 6.7 meters below the surface, in the longitudinal axis of the formation, that is, running along its length, from bow to stern, exactly where the central corridor of a ship would be, GPR detected a reflection anomaly that did not correspond to any known natural geological interface. It was a corridor, approximately 4 meters wide, linear, continuous over a significant extent of the formation's central axis. And on the sides of this central corridor, at regular angles, the radar detected what researchers described in technical reports as chambers or compartments, spaces with internal density distinct from the material around them, arranged in a pattern that American researcher Andrew Jones, a specialist in GPR data interpretation, described with a sentence that became the most cited of the entire project. It is exactly what you would expect to find if this were a man-made boat. But the most disturbing piece of data was not the central corridor. It was what the radar detected above it. At 3 distinct depth levels, separated by regular intervals of approximately 1.5 to 2 meters each, GPR recorded horizontal reflection interfaces that ran parallel to the surface of the formation throughout its entire length. 3 layers, superimposed, with a regularity that computer processing of the data confirmed to be statistically inconsistent with natural geological stratification. In any large wooden ship, you would find exactly this structure: a lower deck, a middle deck, and an upper deck, separated by regular distances determined by the height of the internal spaces necessary to house cargo or passengers. The Book of Genesis, chapter 6, verse 16, describes the ark with a specific instruction: "With lower, second, and third stories shalt thou make it." 3 floors, 3 decks. The radar detected 3 horizontal layers. This is not proof. It is necessary to say this clearly. The correspondence between the radar data and the biblical text is remarkable, but correspondence is not causality, and GPR data needs verification by physical excavation to confirm exactly what is producing the detected reflection anomalies. Ancient mineralized wood reflects in GPR differently than the surrounding sedimentary rock. But rock of a different composition can also produce similar reflection patterns under certain geological conditions. The Noah's Ark Scans team was honest about this limitation from the beginning, and included in the technical reports a list of alternative hypotheses that the data does not completely rule out. But there is an additional detail that the GPR data revealed, and that alternative geological hypotheses have difficulty explaining. The detected anomalies are not continuous throughout the entire formation. They have interruptions, discontinuities, points where the regular pattern is broken abruptly, as would be expected if the original structure had suffered damage or differential decomposition over millennia, with some sections better preserved than others. A natural geological fold would have continuous and regular stratification throughout its entire extent. An ancient, partially decomposed artificial structure would have exactly the pattern of discontinuities that GPR recorded. And when the team completed the processing of all the data collected and generated the full 3-dimensional image of the interior of the formation, the result was disturbing enough for the project to immediately plan a second phase of investigation, this time combining GPR with 2 other instruments that together would form the most complete set of evidence ever collected about the Durupinar Formation. What these additional instruments found in the soil around and inside the formation did not leave the team with simpler answers. It left them with much more difficult questions. Radar sees structure, but soil tells a story. There is a fundamental difference between identifying the shape of something and understanding what that something is made of. GPR can show that there is an anomaly at 6.7 meters deep with the geometry of a corridor. What it cannot do is tell if that corridor is empty space, mineralized wood, rock of a different composition, or anything else that produces the same reflection pattern. To answer that question, you need chemistry. The Noah's Ark Scans project team collected nearly 30 soil and rock samples throughout their field campaigns. Some from inside the formation, collected through minimally invasive drillings that disturb the stratigraphic context as little as possible, and others from the terrain immediately around the formation, at points chosen to serve as comparison controls. All samples were sent for laboratory analysis at Istanbul Technical University, one of the most respected research institutions in Turkey, with geochemistry and soil analysis laboratories that follow standardized international protocols. The results arrived in stages throughout 2021 and 2022, and when the team systematically compared the data from the internal samples with the data from the control samples, two results stood out with a consistency that the researchers described as unexpected. The first was the organic content. Common soil in the Mount Ararat region, mountain slope soil at an altitude of 2,300 meters, subject to freeze-thaw cycles with sparse vegetation cover, presents a relatively low and homogeneous organic content. The control samples collected around the formation confirmed this pattern: consistent organic content with no significant variations from point to point. The samples collected from inside the formation presented an organic content significantly higher than the surrounding terrain, not marginally higher, substantially higher, at levels that the laboratories classified as statistically anomalous in relation to the local geological context. High organic content in the soil indicates the decomposition of biological material. Matter that was once alive, plants, animals, or wood, decomposes and leaves a specific chemical signature in the soil: organic carbon, nitrogen compounds, humic acids. The more organic material that has decomposed in a given location over time, the richer in organic carbon the soil of that point becomes. The most obvious hypothesis to explain a high organic content inside a rock formation at an altitude of 2,300 meters is the decomposition of ancient wood. A wooden structure of large dimensions, buried and subjected to millennia of slow decomposition in an environment of varying humidity, would leave exactly this type of chemical signature in the surrounding soil. The second result was even more specific. The potassium content of the internal samples was consistently higher than that of the control samples. Potassium is an abundant element in nature, but its concentration in the soil varies according to the composition of the underlying rock and the biological processes that occurred on site. Decomposing wood releases potassium into the soil. It is a documented and quantifiable chemical process. The combination of high organic content with increased potassium concentration, concentrated specifically inside the formation and absent in the surrounding terrain, produced a chemical profile that analysts from Istanbul Technical University described in the reports as consistent with the decomposition of a large volume of woody material. Wood, in a quantity sufficient to alter the chemical composition of the soil in an extensive area, at 2,300 meters of altitude. In a region where no forest has existed in the last millennia, this does not prove it is Noah's Ark. It needs to be said with absolute clarity. Wood could have arrived at that location by countless processes: mud flows that transported plant debris from lower regions, human structures from known historical periods, peat bog formations in ancient climatic conditions very different from the current ones. But each of these alternative explanations has a specific problem that the data makes difficult to ignore. Mud flows transport debris randomly and do not produce the regular internal chemical concentrations detected. They produce irregular and diffuse distribution along the flow, not concentration within a defined outline. Historical human structures in the Mount Ararat region are well documented, and none of them are located at this specific point. And climatic conditions that would allow peat bog formation at 2,300 meters of altitude in that region do not exist in the paleoclimatic records available for the last 10,000 years. But the chemical data was not alone. There was a third result that the team was not expecting to find. The analyses revealed the presence of marine deposits and remains of mollusks in the samples collected in the region around the formation. Shells, fragments of organisms that live in a marine environment, oceanic or closed sea, found on a mountain slope at 2,300 meters of altitude. The presence of marine fossils at high altitudes is not in itself extraordinary. The process of tectonic uplift can elevate ancient marine sediments to high altitudes over millions of years. The Alps and the Himalayas are full of marine fossils elevated by the collision of tectonic plates. But what made these specific marine deposits relevant to the investigation was the dating. The carbon-14 analyses performed on the organic fragments associated with the marine deposits produced dates that the researchers took some time to process. Because the dates pointed not to millions of years of tectonic uplift, but to approximately 5,000 years ago. 5,000 years, which corresponds within the margins of error of the method to the period between 4,800 and 5,200 years before the present. This is precisely the period that traditional biblical chronologies associate with Noah's flood. And it is also the period that the geological hypothesis of the catastrophic flooding of the Black Sea, proposed by researchers Ryan and Pittman, points to as that of one of the greatest water catastrophes in the Middle East in the last 10,000 years. Deposits of marine origin at 2,300 meters of altitude dated to 5,000 years ago. The tectonic explanation does not work for this dating. Geological uplift sufficient to raise marine sediments to 2,300 meters would take tens of millions of years, not 5,000. The only explanation supported by the data for recent marine deposits at high altitude is that that region was submerged or was hit by a water mass of marine origin in a period relatively recent in geological terms. Relatively recent. 5,000 years. When these data were combined with the GPR results and presented together for the first time, the team's reaction was not one of triumph. It was one of extreme caution, because the researchers knew they were in territory where the pressure to confirm a religious theory would be enormous, and where any methodological error would be magnified and used to discredit the entire work. But the data was the data. And the data asked for an answer that conventional geology has not yet provided in a satisfactory way. The next logical step was to drill, to collect core samples directly from the anomalies identified by GPR, to bring the material that was producing those chemical signatures and those radar reflection patterns to the laboratory. That step has not yet been fully taken. And the reason why it hasn't is, in itself, part of the story. The time has come to hear the other side, and the other side has arguments that need to be presented with the same seriousness as the previous evidence. Because a documentary that ignores legitimate objections is not an investigation. It is propaganda. And the subject of Noah's Ark already has enough propaganda in both directions. The position of mainstream geology and archaeology on the Durupinar Formation can be summarized in 3 words: known natural formation. Turkish geologist Ahmet Ali Arslan, who visited the site on multiple occasions and published analyses of the formation, argues that the hull-shaped outline is the result of a geological process called diapirism, a phenomenon in which lower-density material, such as salt or plastic clay, pushes upward through layers of denser rock, creating salient structures with outlines that can be elliptical or oval, depending on pressure conditions and terrain composition. Mount Ararat and its region are geologically active. The area lies in a convergence zone of tectonic plates, the point where the Arabian plate pushes against the Eurasian plate, producing frequent earthquakes, volcanism, and exactly the type of subsurface pressure that favors diapirism phenomena. Structures with unusual outlines produced by these processes are documented throughout the eastern region of Turkey. This argument is solid, and it needs to be taken seriously. The second geological objection concerns the anomalies detected by GPR. Geologists who analyze the data published by the Noah's Ark Scans project point out that subsoil density variations are extremely common in terrains of volcanic and sedimentary origin like those of Mount Ararat. Basalt intrusions, pockets of compacted clay, variations in the mineral composition of sedimentary layers. All these natural processes can produce radar reflection patterns that, when computer processed, generate images resembling artificial structures to eyes that are looking for artificial structures. This phenomenon has a name in remote sensing literature: geophysical pareidolia. It is the tendency to identify significant patterns in data that contains random noise, the geological equivalent of seeing faces in clouds. It is not dishonesty. It is a well-documented cognitive bias that affects even experienced researchers, especially when working in a context where there is already a strong hypothesis they want to confirm or refute. The third objection is about the organic content and potassium. Mountain slope soils in regions of recent volcanism, and Mount Ararat is a volcano, frequently present localized variations in chemical composition that have nothing to do with the decomposition of artificial organic material. Lava flows of different compositions, pyroclastic deposits, variations in the mineral composition of basalt. All this can produce localized elevations of potassium and organic carbon at a specific point in the terrain without any relationship to human structures. The very fact that Mount Ararat is a volcano, the largest in Turkey, with more than 5,137 meters of altitude, which had its last significant eruption in 1840, makes any geochemical analysis of the region extraordinarily complex. Volcanoes are geochemically noisy. They produce soil composition anomalies that can mimic signatures of organic decomposition. The fourth objection, and perhaps the most powerful of all, is about the marine deposits dated to 5,000 years ago. Geologists who study the region point out that Mount Ararat was covered by extensive glaciers during the last glacial period, and that the retreat of these glaciers, combined with the intense tectonic activity of the region, may have transported and deposited sediments of very diverse origins at unexpected points on the slope. Ancient marine sediments, much older than 5,000 years, may have been reworked and redeposited by glacial and fluvial processes, producing carbon-14 datings that reflect the age of the original organic material, not the age of the deposition event. This is technically plausible, and it is a real limitation of the carbon-14 dating method when applied to reworked sediments. But there is a dimension to this academic resistance that goes beyond legitimate technical objections, and that needs to be named honestly. The subject of Noah's Ark carries a cultural and religious weight that contaminates any scientific investigation in the area in both directions. On one hand, there is a biblical research community, well-funded, motivated, numerous, that for decades produced claims about the Ark that did not stand up to scientific scrutiny. Expeditions that found cypress wood on Mount Ararat that was later dated to medieval periods. Photographs of structures that were common rock formations. Accounts from divers and climbers who saw the Ark partially exposed but never brought verifiable evidence. This history of unverified claims created a reflex of immediate rejection in the mainstream scientific community for anything related to Noah's Ark. It is not scientific skepticism applied with rigor. It is skepticism conditioned by decades of disappointment with researchers who prioritized confirmation of faith over methodological integrity. The practical result is that serious researchers with proper methodology and legitimate data encounter a barrier of institutional resistance that has nothing to do with the quality of their work. It has to do with the history of those who came before them. This is unfair, and it is simultaneously completely understandable. There is also a political dimension that rarely appears in discussions on the subject, but that researchers working in the region know well. Mount Ararat is not just a mountain for Turkey. It is a national symbol. The mountain that appears on the coat of arms of Armenia, in a territory that is today Turkish, in a historical context of one of the most painful territorial disputes and memories of genocide of the 20th century. Any large-scale archaeological discovery on Mount Ararat would have political implications going far beyond archaeology. A confirmed discovery of Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat would transform the mountain into one of the most visited religious sites in the world, with all the economic, political, and sovereignty implications that would entail in a territory whose recent history is extraordinarily sensitive. Governments are not neutral entities when it comes to politically charged archaeology. And Turkey, like Saudi Arabia in the case of the Gulf of Aqaba, has reasons beyond science to carefully control what is investigated, how it is investigated, and what is published about Mount Ararat. What all this means for the current investigation is that the Noah's Ark Scans team operates in a minefield, technical, academic, and political, that would make any research difficult even if the object of investigation were completely non-controversial. And the object of investigation is as far from non-controversial as possible. What official science says at its core is, prove it. Bring artifacts recovered in a controlled excavation. Publish in peer-reviewed journals. Submit your data to the scrutiny of independent researchers with no link to biblical research organizations. It is a reasonable standard. It is the correct standard. And it is exactly the standard that the next phase of the Noah's Ark Scans project is trying to meet, with a planned drilling that, if authorized and executed correctly, could finally transform the discussion from hypothesis to evidence. Or it could confirm, once and for all, that there is a geological explanation for everything that was found. In any case, the answer is a few meters deep, and the distance between the question and the answer has never been smaller. GPR was the first instrument. It was not the last. The Noah's Ark Scans project team understood from the beginning that no single technology would be enough to produce a solid scientific case about the Durupinar Formation. Every instrument has limitations. Every method has blind spots. The strength of a serious geophysical investigation lies in convergence, when multiple independent technologies with completely different physical principles point to the same result. It was with this philosophy that the team complemented GPR with two other instruments, LiDAR and ERT. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, is a mapping technology that uses laser pulses to measure distances with millimeter precision. A LiDAR scanner emits millions of laser pulses per second in all directions and measures the time each pulse takes to reflect back to the sensor after hitting a surface. The result is a three-dimensional point cloud, a digital map of the surface with resolution and precision that no conventional photography can produce. For archaeology, LiDAR revolutionized the investigation of sites hidden by vegetation or soil deposits. It was with LiDAR that researchers identified, starting in 2010, hundreds of previously unknown Maya cities in the Guatemalan jungle. Structures that had been literally invisible to centuries of conventional exploration because the vegetation cover completely concealed them. The laser penetrates the vegetation, reflects off the solid surfaces below, and reveals what is hidden. In the case of the Durupinar Formation, LiDAR was used to produce the most precise surface map ever created of the formation and its relationship with the surrounding terrain. The result confirmed something that conventional aerial photographs suggested, but could not quantify with precision. The elevation profile of the formation is consistent with what would be expected of a buried solid structure, with elevations and depressions that follow a coherent internal pattern, not the random pattern of a geological fold subjected to differential erosion. More specifically, the LiDAR map revealed that the prow of the formation, the northern pointier end, has an elevation profile that is remarkably symmetrical relative to the structure's longitudinal axis. Bilateral symmetry in natural geological formations exists, but it is relatively rare in large-scale objects produced by tectonic or mass flow processes. In structures built by human beings, bilateral symmetry is almost universal, because any vessel needs to be symmetrical to float in balance. ERT, electrical resistivity. Tomography works on a completely different principle than GPR and LiDAR. Instead of electromagnetic waves or lasers, ERT injects electrical current into the ground through electrodes inserted into the surface and measures how that current propagates through the subsoil. Different materials have different electrical resistivities. Solid rock conducts electricity one way, moist clay another, dry wood another, empty space yet another. By mapping the distribution of electrical resistivity in the subsoil, ERT produces cross-sectional images of what exists below the surface, with a penetration depth often superior to that of GPR. The combined application of GPR and ERT in the same area, with the two instruments producing subsoil images based on completely independent physical principles, is considered in applied geophysics as one of the most robust approaches available for non-invasive investigation. When the two methods agree, confidence in the result increases substantially. When they disagree, it indicates there is something in the subsoil that deserves more detailed investigation. In the case of the Durupinar Formation, GPR and ERT agreed. The electrical resistivity anomalies detected by ERT corresponded spatially, that is, they were at the same points in depth, to the reflection anomalies detected by GPR. The central corridor identified by the radar also appeared on the electrical resistivity map as a zone of low resistivity, surrounded by material of higher resistivity. Exactly the pattern that would be produced by a space partially filled with material of a different composition than the surrounding rock. The three horizontal layers detected by GPR also appeared in ERT as resistivity interfaces, transitions between materials of different electrical conductivity arranged at levels corresponding to the depths identified by the radar. The convergence between two instruments based on completely independent physical principles is the type of result that in any other archaeological context would immediately lead to the opening of a formal excavation with institutional funding. But there is a third set of data that the combination of LiDAR, GPR, and ERT produced, and that is perhaps the most difficult to explain geologically. When the researchers superimposed the three-dimensional maps produced by the three instruments, the LiDAR surface, the GPR subsoil, and the ERT resistivity profile, and generated an integrated three-dimensional model of the formation, the result showed something that none of the isolated instruments had clearly revealed. The internal structure of the formation is not homogeneous throughout its length. It has regions of better preservation, where the anomalies are clearer, more defined, more consistent, and regions of greater deterioration, where the signals are weaker and more fragmented. And the distribution of these regions of differential preservation is not random. It follows a pattern. The regions of best preservation are concentrated at the ends of the formation, prow and stern, and in the central portion where the corridor was identified. The regions of greatest deterioration are on the sides, especially at the edges where the formation meets the surrounding mudflow. For a wooden structure buried and subjected to millennia of decomposition, this physical pattern makes sense. The ends of a hull are the most structurally robust parts, built with thicker wood to withstand the impact of waves. The central corridor of a ship is supported by keel beams, the densest and most durable pieces of the entire structure. The sides of the hull, built with thinner planks to reduce weight, would be the first to decompose. For a natural geological fold subjected to differential erosion, this specific pattern of preservation would be much harder to explain, because geological erosion normally attacks the ends and the elevated parts of a formation, not the lateral parts. When the integrated three-dimensional model was first presented at an applied geophysics seminar in Istanbul, the reaction of the geologists present was divided. Some maintained the position that there were alternative geological explanations that needed to be tested, while others recognized that the combined pattern of the three instruments was anomalous enough to justify deeper investigation. None of those present were able to present at that moment a specific geological model that satisfactorily explained all the data simultaneously. And it is exactly at this point, in the space between "I have no alternative explanation and therefore it is Noah's Ark," that serious scientific investigation needs to operate with the greatest possible caution, because the absence of a convincing alternative explanation is not proof that the Ark hypothesis is correct. It is only evidence that the question is not yet resolved. And an unresolved question, with data of this quality, has only one legitimate scientific path forward: to drill, to collect, to analyze, to publish. What they found, when they finally got closer to the surface of the formation in 2026, changed the tone of the entire investigation. In March of 2026, workers were carrying out expansion works on a local road in the Durupinar region, the Turkish municipality closest to the Durupinar Formation, approximately 29 kilometers south of the peak of Mount Ararat. When the machine's buckets encountered something that interrupted the work: pottery fragments, not an isolated fragment, not modern discarded material. A concentration of pottery shards of different sizes, with hand-worked surfaces, with markings and textures that any archaeologist would immediately recognize as incompatible with any recent historical period. The work was halted, the fragments were collected, and when they reached the hands of the professor responsible for the analysis, a ceramicist with experience in ancient Middle Eastern artifacts, the result of the preliminary dating produced a number that no one on the team expected to hear in that specific context. Between 5,500 and 3,000 years before Christ, the Chalcolithic period, the Copper Age, the interval of time that archaeologists identify as the transition period between the first established agricultural societies and the first urban civilizations of the Middle East, the same period when Ur, Eridu, and the first Sumerian cities were emerging in Mesopotamia, the same period that traditional biblical chronologies associate with Noah's flood. Chalcolithic pottery has specific and well-documented characteristics that distinguish it from earlier and later periods. The manufacturing technique, manual rolling without the use of a potter's wheel, which would only be introduced in the region in the following period, leaves finger marks and specific texture patterns that specialists identify with confidence. The composition of the clay and the firing methods produce mineralogical signatures that laboratories can date with reasonable precision even without carbon-14 analysis. The fragments found in the Durupinar works corresponded to the Chalcolithic profile in all aspects analyzed. What this means for the investigation of the Durupinar Formation is a question that the researchers involved were careful not to answer prematurely. Chalcolithic pottery in the region does not prove that the formation is Noah's Ark. It proves that human beings lived and operated in that specific region during the Chalcolithic period, which in itself is archaeologically significant in an area that had not been the object of systematic archaeological investigation focused on that period. But the significance of the discovery goes beyond dating. The location of the fragments, in the vicinity of the Durupinar Formation, in an area that until now had received almost exclusive attention from researchers interested in the question of the Ark, and very little attention from conventional archaeologists, raises a question that mainstream archaeology will need to answer. Why was there a Chalcolithic human settlement at this specific point on the slope of Mount Ararat? The Do-Bayazit region is not particularly hospitable for human settlement. The altitude and climate make agriculture difficult. The volcanic and unstable terrain does not offer the advantages that normally attract ancient populations: navigable rivers, fertile alluvial soils, natural shelter from prevailing winds. Chalcolithic civilizations in the Middle East tended to settle in river valleys, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Jordan, not on mountain slopes at 2,000 meters of altitude. The presence of Chalcolithic pottery in that specific place suggests there was a reason for people to be there, a reason strong enough to justify the establishment of human presence in a terrain that did not offer the typical advantages of a settlement site. The professor responsible for the analysis of the fragments was direct in his public statement: the site needs immediate formal protection. His concern was not abstract. In the weeks following the news of the Chalcolithic finds, the number of visitors to the Durupinar Formation increased significantly. Tourists, pilgrims, and curious onlookers arriving at the site, and in some cases documented in videos circulating on social media, removing stones, rock fragments, and any material they found on the surface. In archaeology, context is everything. An artifact removed from the soil without documentation of its exact position, the stratigraphic layer it was in, the adjacent materials, and its orientation loses most of its scientific value. It can still be dated, it can still be chemically analyzed, but the information about what was around it, the information that allows reconstructing the event that produced that deposit, is irreversibly destroyed. Every stone taken by a well-meaning tourist is a data point that science will never recover. The Turkish government responded to pressure from the professor and other researchers with a speed that surprised the local archaeological community. Within weeks after the disclosure of the finds, the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism began the process of formal classification of the area as a protected archaeological site, a designation that, when complete, will prohibit unauthorized excavations, restrict visitor access to the immediate area of the formation, and require that any future research be conducted with government approval and supervision. This rapid response was interpreted in different ways by different groups. For the Noah's Ark Scans project researchers, classification as a protected site is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it protects the site from depredation by unauthorized visitors, which is clearly necessary. On the other hand, the classification places control of future investigation firmly in the hands of the Turkish government, which will decide who can excavate, when, with what methodology, and what can be published about the results. It is the same pattern we saw in Saudi Arabia with Jebel al-Lawz, official protection that simultaneously preserves and controls. For conventional archaeologists, the classification is a positive development that could eventually lead to a formal and well-documented excavation, the type of investigation that would produce data solid enough to resolve the issue definitively. For biblical research groups that have followed the case for decades, the rapid response from the Turkish government is, in itself, a sign. The perception that the authorities know there is something there that needs to be controlled before it reaches public knowledge in an unmanaged way. Each of these interpretations is plausible. None is verifiable without more information. What is verifiable is the following. In March of 2026, the Durupinar Formation stopped being just an object of debate between biblical researchers and skeptical geologists. With the discovery of the Chalcolithic fragments and the response from the Turkish government, it formally entered the radar of institutional archaeology. And when institutional archaeology puts something on the radar, the process that follows, slow, bureaucratic, politically charged, but methodologically rigorous, is the only one that can produce an answer the world will accept. Or that it will have to accept, because the 5,000-year-old pottery fragments have not disappeared. They are in the lab. They are being analyzed. And the question they ask, why there were people here in this specific spot, in this specific period, is still waiting for an answer that no geologist, no archaeologist, and no theologian has managed to give in a completely satisfactory way. The answer could be a few meters below the surface of that slope. And for the first time in 60 years of investigation, there is a real chance that someone will go after it with the right tools. There is a principle that any researcher who works with archaeology in Middle Eastern countries learns early, usually in the hardest way possible. The soil belongs to the state, not metaphorically, legally. In practically every country in the region, Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Jordan, Iran, any artifact found below the surface is government property, regardless of who funded the excavation, who carried it out, or who discovered it. The researcher can publish, can photograph, can analyze, but they cannot export, they cannot retain, and they cannot unilaterally determine what happens to the material found. This system exists for legitimate reasons. Decades of colonial plunder, European and American museums full of artifacts removed from the Middle East without consent during the 19th and 20th centuries, created legal protection structures that are reasonable and necessary. The problem begins when these legitimate protection structures are used not only to preserve heritage, but to control what is found, how it is interpreted, and what the public is allowed to know. In the case of Turkey and the Durupinar Formation, this tension is particularly acute. Turkey has a complex relationship with its own archaeology. The country is one of the richest in the world in terms of archaeological heritage. Çatalhöyük, Göbekli Tepe, Ephesus, Troy, Cappadocia, and the Turkish government has invested significantly in archaeology as a tool for tourism and the assertion of national identity. The opening of the Göbekli Tepe Museum, the site that redefined the understanding of the beginning of human civilization, was accompanied by an international marketing campaign that transformed an archaeological site into a first-class world tourist attraction. But Göbekli Tepe has no religious implications for Islam, Judaism, or Christianity. It is prehistoric archaeology, fascinating, revolutionary, but politically neutral. The Durupinar Formation does not have that luxury. Mount Ararat, Aradağ in Turkish, is the highest mountain in Turkey and one of the country's most charged national symbols. It appears on the coat of arms of Armenia, the neighboring country with whom Turkey has one of the most difficult relationships of the 20th century, marked by the Armenian genocide of 1915, an event Turkey still does not officially recognize, and by the century-long territorial dispute over the region where Ararat is located. For the Turkish government, Mount Ararat is not just a mountain. It is an object of sovereignty, a territorial assertion. Any event of global reach that centers on Mount Ararat and confirmation of Noah's Ark would be the most watched archaeological event in human history, would inevitably have political dimensions that the Turkish government would need to manage with extreme care. A confirmed discovery of Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat would transform the mountain into a pilgrimage site for Christians, Jews, and Muslims simultaneously, the three great monotheistic groups that recognize the Noah narrative. The flow of visitors would be on a scale that the current infrastructure of the Doğu Bayazıt region has no remote condition to absorb, and international pressure on Turkey to ensure access to the site, from governments, religious organizations, archaeological groups, global media, would be of unprecedented intensity. The Turkish government knows this, and the way it is managing the process of classifying the Durupinar Formation as a protected site suggests it is thinking about all these implications with much more care than official communiques reveal. There is a specific pattern of behavior that independent researchers working in the region identify in recent years. Access to the Durupinar Formation site has not been blocked. Unlike Jebel al-Lawz in Saudi Arabia, Mount Ararat receives visitors, climbers, tourists, research groups regularly. The Turkish government has not surrounded the formation with armed guards or prohibited photographs. What the Turkish government did was something more subtle and, in a way, more effective. It created a bureaucratic authorization process for scientific research that is complex enough to filter out casual researchers, but permeable enough to allow selected research, like the Noah's Ark Scans project, which works with official approval, to proceed under controlled supervision. This control model has an obvious strategic advantage for the government. If the results are negative, if drilling and excavation confirm it is just a geological formation, the government can release the results as proof of scientific rigor and close the matter. If the results are positive, if the excavation finds incontestable evidence of an artificial structure, the government controls the timing, context, and narrative of the disclosure. In neither of the two scenarios is the government caught by surprise. There is also an internal religious dimension that complicates Turkish political calculus in ways rarely discussed in the international press. Turkey is a country with a majority Muslim population and a government that in the last 2 decades has increasingly used Islamic references in its political rhetoric. The Quran explicitly mentions Noah's Ark, called Nu, and identifies the resting place of the Ark as Mount Judi, a mountain located in southeastern Turkey, not Ararat. If the Ark were found on Mount Ararat and not on Mount Judi, this would create an internal theological tension for Turkish Muslims that the government would need to manage. The dominant Islamic narrative places the Ark in a different location than what archaeology is investigating. A discovery on Ararat would be simultaneously a confirmation of the shared Abrahamic narrative and a complication of the specific Islamic narrative. This tension is not paralyzing. Islam has a tradition of textual reinterpretation that could accommodate a discovery on Ararat without a theological crisis. But it is a dimension that the Turkish government needs to consider carefully before any official announcement. The result of all these pressures, territorial politics, historical memory, tourism, theology, archaeological sovereignty, is that the investigation of the Durupinar Formation moves at a speed that frustrates researchers but makes perfect sense from the state's point of view. Slow enough to manage the implications, fast enough to maintain control of the process before independent researchers do so without authorization. It is the same rhythm we see in all politically sensitive archaeological investigations in the Middle East. It is not a conspiracy. It is state bureaucracy, operating exactly as state bureaucracy operates when the interests are large enough. And the interests here are, by any metric used, large enough. What happens when this bureaucratic process finally produces an authorized and rigorous excavation, when the drillings planned by the Noah's Ark Scans project receive formal approval and the bit descends to the anomalies identified by GPR, is the question that defines the next chapter of this investigation. But before we get there is a set of evidence that rarely appears in popular discussions about the Durupinar Formation, and that when placed side by side with everything already presented, changes the weight of the argument in ways that deserve careful attention. Serious archaeological investigations never depend on a single site. The context around a formation, what exists in the immediately surrounding kilometers, what local tradition has preserved, what other researchers have found in adjacent regions, is frequently as revealing as the main site, sometimes more. In the case of the Durupinar Formation, there is a set of correlate evidence that receives a minimal fraction of the attention dedicated to radar, soil, and pottery fragments, but which, when put into perspective, adds layers to the argument that go far beyond what any geophysical instrument can produce alone. The first of these pieces of evidence is geographic, and it starts with a name. The nearest village to the Durupinar Formation is called Uzengili. but that was not its original name. Until 1948, the village was called Nasar, a word that researchers of ancient Semitic languages identify as a cognate of the Hebrew Natsar, which means the one who was preserved, or the survivor. A village called the Survivor. Less than 3 kilometers from a ship's hull-shaped formation on Mount Ararat, the mountain where Abrahamic tradition says the only survivor of the flood ran aground. Place names are memory. The oral traditions of populations living in a place for millennia frequently preserve information about past events through the names they give to mountains, rivers, valleys, and villages, long after any written record has been lost. Toponomastics, the study of the origin and meaning of place names, is a legitimate and widely used archaeological tool for identifying sites of potential historical interest. The name Nasar proves nothing, but it is the type of data that in any other archaeological context would immediately lead to systematic investigation. The second correlate evidence is structural, and it comes from an unexpected source. Approximately 3 kilometers from the Durupinar Formation, independent researchers identified what they describe as the remains of a large-scale stone structure. A set of worked blocks arranged in a pattern that is not consistent with natural construction, nor with known modern or medieval buildings in the region. The structure was documented photographically, but never subjected to formal archaeological excavation. The photographs have circulated in biblical research communities since the 90s, but were never published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. The usual problem: absence of rigorous methodology, absence of independent analysis, absence of documented chain of custody. But the structure exists, it is on the ground. And its dimensions, according to measurements by independent researchers, correspond approximately to what would be expected of a construction from the Chalcolithic period, the same period as the pottery fragments found in March of 2026. Local tradition, preserved in accounts from older residents of the region collected by researchers throughout the 80s and 90s, identifies this structure as the site where Noah would have built an altar after disembarking from the ark. The book of Genesis, chapter 8, verse 20, describes exactly that. Noah's first action after the flood was to build an altar and make offerings. The correspondence between local tradition, geographic location, and biblical text is remarkable. The scientific problem remains the same as always. Remarkable is not verified. The third correlate evidence is the oldest, and possibly the most disturbing for those who prefer this to be an exclusively modern issue. The Roman historian Flavius Josephus, writing in the 1st century AD, mentions in his work Antiquities of the Jews that authors before him, including the Babylonian historian Berossus, who lived in the 3rd century BC, described the existence of remains of the Ark on Mount Ararat and mentioned that local inhabitants scraped bitumen from the structure to use as a protective amulet against diseases. Berossus wrote 700 years before Josephus. He was describing a tradition that, in his time, was already considered ancient. What this means is that the narrative of physical remains of a vessel on Mount Ararat did not start with modern researchers of the 20th century. It has at least 2,300 years of documented historical record. The bitumen is a specific detail that deserves attention. The book of Genesis describes Noah covering the ark with bitumen, inside and out, to waterproof it. Bitumen is natural tar, a petroleum-derived material that exists naturally in the Middle East and was widely used for waterproofing in structures of the 2nd and 3rd millennium BC. Its presence in an ancient wooden structure would be archaeologically detectable, and it would be exactly the type of material that a chemical analysis of soil samples could identify. The analyses by Istanbul Technical University did not include a specific search for bitumen in the samples collected. It is a gap that subsequent researchers have already identified and that the next sampling phase intends to correct. The fourth correlate evidence is iconographic. In the Archaeology Museum of Ankara, there is an ancient coin, dated to the period of King Decebalus of Dacia, approximately in the 1st century AD, that shows a vessel with animals inside and a human figure standing upon it. The iconographic style is consistent with representations of Noah that appear on other artifacts from the same period in the Middle East. Coins from various historical periods from different cultures around Anatolia and the Middle East show similar versions: an ark, a man, animals, a dove. The iconography of Noah's Ark was established enough in the Hellenistic and Roman period to be used on common circulation coins. This is not archaeological proof of the physical existence of the Ark. It is proof that the narrative was treated as a real historical reference, not as a myth by diverse cultures in a period when there was still collective memory of much older oral traditions. There is an important distinction between a story people tell as a legend and a story people use on everyday trade coins. Coins are practical instruments. They convey symbols of authority, of identity, and of references that the population using them recognizes and accepts as real. The fifth correlate evidence is paleoclimatic, and it is the one with the most solid scientific support of all. Analyses of ice cores collected from Mount Ararat's glaciers and from lakes in the region revealed a layer of anomalous sediment dated to approximately 5,000 years ago, corresponding to the same Chalcolithic period as the pottery fragments, which paleoclimatologists associate with a significant flooding event in the region. The layer is thin but chemically distinct from adjacent layers, with a composition suggesting rapid deposition of material carried by water in large volume. A regional flood event, dated to 5,000 years, on Mount Ararat, leaving a detectable physical trail in ice cores. Each of these 5 correlate pieces of evidence: the village name, the stone structure, the historical accounts of Berossus and Josephus, the iconography of ancient coins, and the paleoclimatic flood layer can be individually explained without reference to Noah's Ark. The name could be a linguistic coincidence, the structure could be medieval, the historical accounts could be mythical tradition unrelated to real physical evidence. The coins are cultural iconography. The paleoclimatic layer could be regional flooding of tectonic origin, but when you put the 5 together, and the 5 together with the data from GPR, ERT, LiDAR, chemical soil analyses, and Chalcolithic fragments, the emerging pattern is no longer explainable by every skeptic's favorite word: coincidence. And when coincidence ceases to be a sufficient explanation, what remains is a question that science has an obligation to answer. In 2026, that question is closer to an answer than at any other time in the last 60 years. But the current state of the debate, who is investigating, who turned away, and what still has no answer, reveals that the path to that answer is more complicated than any geophysical data suggests. In 2026, the investigation of the Durupinar Formation is at a turning point that did not exist at any previous moment in the last 60 years. Not because the answer is closer than ever, although it is, but because the profile of the researchers involved changed in a way that makes the debate fundamentally different from what it was in the time of Ron Wyatt and the first enthusiasts who visited the site in the 80s and 90s. For 40 years, the investigation of the Durupinar Formation was dominated by 2 groups that rarely communicated productively. On one side, biblical archaeology researchers, frequently linked to religious organizations, funded by donations from faith communities, motivated by the prior conviction that the Ark exists and that Mount Ararat is its resting place. This group produced an enormous volume of material, books, documentaries, reports, but very little that stood up to the methodological scrutiny of conventional archaeology. On the other side, mainstream geologists and archaeologists who had discarded the subject after the first analyses in the 60s and who treated any new claim about the Ark with a skepticism that bordered on a conditioned reflex. Not because they evaluated the new data with rigor, but because the history of unverified claims had exhausted institutional patience. The Noah's Ark Scans project represented a genuine attempt to occupy the space between these two groups. With rigorous methodology, data transparency, and an official posture of neutrality regarding the result. This attempt was partially successful. Partially because complete neutrality on a subject with this much charge is, in practice, impossible to maintain. Some of the researchers who participated in the early phases of the project moved away over the following years. Reasons vary depending on who you ask. Some left due to methodological disagreements, concerns about the way GPR data was interpreted and presented publicly before passing sufficient independent review. Others left due to institutional pressure, university professors who received clear signals that public association with Noah's Ark research was harming their academic careers. A Turkish researcher who participated in the first field campaigns declared publicly in 2023 that he had left the project because he felt the conclusions were being communicated to the public more assertively than the data justified. That departure was significant and honest, and it needs to be recorded here with the same weight as any other piece of data in this investigation. Because a researcher who leaves a project because they feel conclusions are being exaggerated is not saying the evidence is false. They are saying the distance between the evidence and the conclusions communicated publicly is greater than scientific methodology allows. This is a legitimate internal critique, and it is the type of self-criticism that distinguishes serious scientific investigation from belief confirmation. The researchers who remain in the project in 2026, including American researcher Andrew Jones, who remains the most cited technical voice of the project, maintain a posture that can be summarized as follows. The data are anomalous, the conventional geological explanation is insufficient, and the only way to resolve the issue is to drill. Drilling, the collection of soil cores directly from the anomalies identified by GPR and ERT, is the inevitable next step, and the only one that can transform hypothesis into verifiable evidence. The project has planned this phase for years. Authorization from the Turkish government, complicated by the new classification of the site as a protected area, is the current obstacle. In the field of mainstream geology, the position in 2026 is one of revised caution, different from the disregard of previous years, but still far from active engagement. Some Turkish geologists who analyzed the data published by the project recognize that anomalies exist and that they deserve deeper investigation. None have published a definitive refutation of the data, but neither has any published an independent analysis that confirms the project's interpretations. This silence is different from the silence of disregard. It is the silence of someone watching a situation develop that could go in any direction and preferring not to commit publicly before having more data. In conventional Middle Eastern archaeology, the Durupinar Formation continues to be treated as peripheral to the core debates of the area. The major questions of 2nd and 3rd millennium BC archaeology, the origin of the first cities, the transition to writing, Bronze Age trade networks, do not depend on resolving the Ark question. Researchers working on those questions have little professional incentive to get involved in a debate they associate with religious sensationalism. But there is a recent development that could change this calculus. The discovery of Chalcolithic fragments in March of 2026 introduced an element into the debate that conventional archaeology cannot ignore, in the same way it ignores radar and GPR claims. Because Chalcolithic pottery is exactly the type of evidence that conventional archaeologists know how to investigate, know how to date, and know how to publish in peer-reviewed journals. The fragments are in the lab. Formal analysis is underway, and when the results are published, which should happen during 2026 or 2027, they will open, for the first time, a gateway for mainstream archaeology to investigate the Durupinar region with its own tools and its own protocols. Not necessarily to investigate the Ark, to investigate the Chalcolithic settlement, to understand why there were people there in that period. To excavate and document a Chalcolithic archaeological site that, regardless of the Ark question, is potentially significant for understanding the ancient populations of eastern Anatolia. And in a formal archaeological excavation motivated by the Chalcolithic fragments, conducted with rigorous methodology and publication in peer-reviewed journals, any additional evidence found in the subsoil, any anomaly that fits the profile identified by GPR and ERT, cannot be dismissed with the usual argument that data was collected by researchers with a religious agenda. This is the scenario that the most careful researchers following this case identify as the most likely to produce a definitive resolution. Not a direct drilling into GPR anomalies by biblical researchers, but a conventional archaeological excavation motivated by the Chalcolithic fragments that eventually touches the structures the radar detected. When that happens, and in 2026, for the first time, it seems genuinely possible it will happen, the answer will not belong to any specific group. It will not belong to the biblical researchers who investigated the site for decades. It will not belong to the geologists who discarded it. It will not belong to the Turkish government that controls access. It will belong to the data. And the data, as always, has no faith. It has no skepticism. It has only the weight of what is real. What is real on that slope of Mount Ararat is still waiting to be completely revealed. And for the first time in 60 years of debate, the revelation seems to be one excavation away. Think about what was presented here, a 163-meter formation with the precise outline of a naval hull on volcanic terrain where no hull should exist. An internal corridor detected by radar at 6.7 meters of depth, 3 layers superimposed with a regularity that geology does not explain. Soil with a chemical signature of wood decomposition in a volume that has no identified origin. Marine deposits dated to 5,000 years at 2,300 meters of altitude. Chalcolithic pottery fragments found in March of 2026 that prove human presence at the site exactly in the period that the biblical flood describes. A village that for millennia carried in its name the word that means survivor. None of this data was fabricated. None belongs to a single researcher with a religious agenda. Each has an independent and verifiable origin, and yet the bit has not gone down. The formal excavation has not happened. The definitive answer does not exist. What exists is a slope in eastern Turkey that guards, literally beneath the feet of those who pass over it, something that the best instruments available today have not been able to classify. Does that bother you? It should bother you, not because the Ark is necessarily there, but because a question of this magnitude, with this volume of anomalous data, with this 2,300-year history of records, with this convergence of independent evidence, should have an answer. And it doesn't. The question that remains for you is this. In your opinion, why doesn't it? Is it scientific incompetence? Is it deliberate political control? Is it the weight of a discovery that no one in the institutions wants to be the first to confirm? Or is there a geological explanation that has not yet been convincingly articulated? Write in the comments. Unfiltered. I want to read what you genuinely think about why this question is still open in 2026, with all the technology available, with all the public interest, with all the data that already exists. This discussion will not end here. If you are not yet subscribed, subscribe now and turn on the bell, because the next investigation appearing on your screen right now involves another archaeological site that governments in the region control with the same tension that Turkey controls Mount Ararat. Same dynamics, even more disturbing evidence. At 6.7 meters of depth on a slope of Mount Ararat, something waits for 5,000 years.